Hello, St. Michael's. This is Reverend Michelle with this week's Bible study overview for our small groups. We're starting lesson 4, which is our final lesson on Amos before continuing with the study of Hosea. And just so you know, I'm not in the sanctuary of St. Michael's, as you can see behind me. I am, however, at Trinity Retreat Center in West Cornwall, Connecticut, and I've located myself in the chapel here, the beautiful stone chapel at Trinity Retreat Center. Now, the focus of this lesson is a theme that we find repeated over and over and over again in the prophets: worship. This is why I'm in the chapel. As we examine exactly why the prophets were offering judgment about how the ancient Israelites worshiped, we really begin to wonder, well, what is worship for? Perhaps more importantly, then who is worship for? And another thing to really understand here, I think, is that these questions are infused with a common concern. We might think that if they're questions about worship, they should be about God. But really, what is apparent is that the common concern is location, location, location. Amos, as we know, is a citizen of the southern kingdom and lived just outside of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the location that is important because for centuries, it was the central place of worship for the ancient Israelites. It was a place where they built their temple, Solomon's temple, which for them was the home of God on earth because it's where they placed the Ark of the Covenant, something you may know from the Indiana Jones movie. Now, just a quick glance backward for context here. The ancient Israelites were wandering for 40 years, right? We remember this from our stories, which is 40 years is a way of saying quite a long time, a generation, really. And as they wandered, they finally found a sense of direction and identity and purpose and community when Moses received the 10 Commandments from God. These 10 Commandments were a covenant with God, and they were specifically for the people of Israel, held as sacred, a sacred covenant. The stone tablets where these words lived were also held as sacred, sacred enough to be placed in the Ark of the Covenant, which is really a large box. On top of the box was the throne of God, more often called the mercy seat of God, because God was known as merciful, benevolent, a saving God. So the ark is the location of God, and this ark became housed in the temple during the reign of Solomon in the location, capital city of Jerusalem. So when the kingdom split into two, the location of Jerusalem could not be claimed by both. So the king in the north, Jeroboam the first, remember that it's Jeroboam the second who is the king when Amos and Hosea are prophesying in our study. So Jeroboam the first, as a way of, if you want to think of it as competing against or pushing against the worship in Jerusalem, Jeroboam the first had 2 golden calves made and placed one in Bethel and the second one in Dan, all the way to the northern edge of the kingdom, replacing the worship in Jerusalem for the people in the north. One could say he did this as a power move, right, to lessen the centrality of Jerusalem in the lives of the Northerners and refocus their identity as separate from the Southerners. And this is all detailed in the book of 1 Kings, chapters 12 and 13. Of course, the Judeans, those in the southern kingdom, were incensed by this act because of how deeply Jerusalem was revered. And you might think that the people north of the border were also just as outraged by this change in worship, but keep in mind what worship meant. The religious life of people was not just dictated by those in power, but religion and government were completely intertwined. Yahweh was the God of Israel. The priests were there to ensure the fealty to the king through worship. The prophets, they were called judges in the book of 1 Kings. The prophets were there to keep the kings in line with Yahweh. And there was no religion without the state, and the state was served by the religion who helped the people to worship Yahweh because God's saving deeds helped them escape from Egypt and arise into a sovereign nation out of the 12 tribes wandering through the desert. So you see, it's all intertwined, meaning the same thing. So if the priests determined this is how we worship now, and the priests were under the command of the king, then that's what happened. Now, allow me to disabuse you of any notion that might be creeping into your consciousness that we have become so much more enlightened as humans, because this is essentially how the Episcopal Church came to be. Not only because, as we know the story, King Henry VIII of England told his priests that they would need to change up the worship and he would be the head of the church, not the Pope. We then have the Church of England. Not only this, but also because the Episcopal Church split from the Church of England during the American Revolution because the government here split from English rule. So the priests here could no longer swear fealty to the King of England. Intertwined. And of course, we also see this happening today in the form of white Christian nationalism. And that's despite our clear and well-known statement about the separation of church and state in the First Amendment to our Constitution in the Bill of Rights. So, for Jeroboam I, this was about power and identity and worship in the north that took the form of Canaanite worship, golden calves that represented Baal, the storm or weather god of the Canaanite people. And Bethel became a new center for worship for the people of the Northern Kingdom. It's worthwhile to note that years later, when the 10th king of the Northern Kingdom rose to power, his name was Jehu, he killed the prophets of Baal and destroyed the temple and still kept the golden calves. Why? Well, that's an interesting question. I honestly don't know the answer to that. But we're going to talk more about Baal and Canaanite worship when we get to the study of Hosea, because Hosea's entire rant is centered on exactly this issue. But this is why Amos ended up in Bethel. The location of Amos's prophecy is important here. He traveled across the border to this particular place as a symbolic act, even though the content of the words only give brief mention in chapter 5, verse 5, where he says, do not seek Bethel, do not go to Gilgal, do not journey to Beersheba, for Gilgal will surely go into exile and Bethel will just be reduced to nothing. So just to catch us up on the other locations here, Gilgal, also listed here, is the location where the ancient Israelites encamped after they crossed over the Jordan and before they invaded the Canaanite city of Jericho. In this location, they also had made a memorial of 12 stones representing the 12 tribes. And it is here that Joshua, the new leader after Moses died, Joshua had ordered a mass circumcision of all the Israelites who had been born in the 40 years of wandering, noting, of course, that those who were considered citizens were men. So Gilgal was this hallowed place in Israelite imagination, a place where the Israelites had claimed once again their allegiance to God through the act of circumcision after wandering for decades. But as we'll learn in Hosea again, Gilgal's worship had fallen because they began sacrificing bulls there, a form of Canaanite worship. And finally, Beersheba, a city not in the northern kingdom at all, but at the southern end of the southern kingdom, is mentioned because it had once been a location of Abraham's worship of Yahweh. But it had since fallen into sacrilegious use as a location for treaties with other nations, acts of disloyalty to the nation of Israel. So by putting Gilgal and Bethel together along with Beersheba, Amos is describing the larger issue here. Just in this one sentence, the sacred has become profane through the intermixing of worship and alliances with outsiders. The people hearing this text had all of these references in their imagination. All of these symbols were alive for them. So when Amos spoke on behalf of God, it's important to understand the symbolic language used by Amos. So when he says, don't seek Bethel, don't go to Gilgal, Do not journey to Beersheba, but seek me and live, says the Lord of the house of Israel. Seek me and live, because I am the God who saved you. I am the God of life. I am the God of Israel, your God who sits on the mercy seat. All of this was alive in their imaginations in hearing Amos's words. Yet the location was originally the land of Canaan. The Canaanites were a people who worshiped Baal, among others, long before the Israelites arrived to build their nation there. Again, we'll talk more about this when we get to Hosea. So, getting back to our questions, what is worship for? Who is worship for? Why do we worship? Is it about whims or a way of grabbing power, as in the case of Jeroboam the first and the cities of Bethel and Dan? Or is it more of a discipline than that? Which is the next question that comes. Is worship about us? And if so, how? Or is it about God? If so, how is it about God? Exactly who is the act of worship meant to serve? So look for Amos's answers, responses to these questions in your study this week as you read Amos. I hope I'll see you on Sunday. Until then, bye for now.